Hi everyone, Kendall here, and welcome to or back to my channel for another week of What's in Your Closet, the sew-along hosted by Pat Sloan at her website, ilovetomakequilts.com. If you haven't done so already, jump over to Pat's website, download this week's free pattern, come back here, and I'll show you how I do it. I know what you're thinking. The fabric on the table doesn't look anything like the directions in the pattern for cutting out the fabrics. And that's because we're still going to make 4 HSTs as per the pattern, but for the other sections of the outside of this block, I'm going to do the 4 at a time flying geese. It's been a hot minute since we've done the 4 at a time flying geese method using the Ultimate Flying Geese tool from Creative Grids, but we finally have a chance to do that here again today. So as you can see up there on the left hand side, I have 2 of my light squares and 2 medium squares. I chose to do medium rather than dark as per in the pattern. And on the right I have a 7 3/4 inch large square in my same medium fabric, which will become the geese part of our 4 at a time flying geese. And I have 4 1/4 inch of my light or background squares. These make the little sky part of your flying geese. So we're going to take the 4 smaller squares here and draw a diagonal line in one direction, and then we need to pin that across our larger square, forming a diagonal across that larger square, which you'll see me do in a moment. We then take that to our machine, and just like our 2 at a time half square triangle method, we stitch 1/4 inch on each side of our drawn line. And just like when I'm creating the 2 at a time half square triangles, I do like to give this a press first after we've sewn to set those seams and settle the stitches down in the fabric. It also takes out any puckering or stretching that may have occurred while we stitched across that bias. We then need to cut this in half along our drawn line and then press each of those peaks up away from the large rectangle. It should look like a love heart or a cat, depending on which way you look at it. We now need to take our remaining 2 4 1/4 inch squares and draw our diagonal line if we didn't do so already at the previous step, and this now gets placed on our cat faces. Now the diagonal line needs to point from the corner of our large triangle up towards that gap in between our 2 smaller triangles. We then take this to the machine, and once again we stitch 1/4 inch on each side of our drawn line. So why am I showing you the 4 at a time flying geese method in this video and not doing the half square triangles? There is an answer to that, but first, Pat, when she drafts these patterns, uses the half square triangles as it gives you the least amount of waste. If we were to do sew and flips, for example, or a traditional flying geese method, you'd have cutaways that you then need to either store and use at a later date, or just throw out and discard. But with the 4 at a time flying geese method, there is very minimal waste when we get to the trim down, you will see that we trim away barely anything. So that's why I made this adaptation. I have made 2 of the What's in Your Closet flimsies, and in the first one that I constructed, which you won't see until the end of the sew along, I did all of the alternate piecing methods, and the amount that I had left over was terrible. So I chose, when doing these videos, to show you the traditional, well, not the traditional, the way that Pat wrote the patterns using the half square triangles. So what we've just done there after stitching our 1/4 inch on each side of our new drawn line is I gave them a press as per usual to settle the stitches before once again slicing them in half on our drawn line. I'm now just pressing these remaining peaks out, and then we will get ready to trim them down. As I said earlier, we will be using the Creative Grid's Ultimate Flying Geese tool to trim these units down, and you'll see there on the top left hand corner of the tool, it gives you all the sizes you need to cut to use this tool to make your half square triangles. It also gives you a letter as a reference for the trimming lines that you need to use, and in my instance it's that solid white line. We line that solid white line up inside the peak of our flying geese unit. We may need to fudge it a little, as you saw over there on the right, and then we can trim those first 2 sides away. We then rotate both the block and the tool, and on the bottom of the tool it has that same white reference line that we once again line up on our cut edges and inside our peak, and we can trim those final 2 sides, and we have the perfect sized flying geese unit. And as you can see, there is very minimal waste. There is a way to do these without having any trimming down, but I'm not a fan of that, as I don't find it as accurate for myself. So I like this method of trimming them down to the perfect size. I have the Ultimate Flying Geese video, which I made a few years ago for you to reference, and I'll pop a card in the top right hand corner here to take you to that video. If you do not have the Ultimate Flying Geese tool, you can use a standard quilting ruler. All you need to do is know that the size here needs to be 6.5 in the width, so we need to recognize where our 3.25 inch mark is. We need to pay attention to our 1/4 inch above that point as well for our seam allowance. We can take a reference from the bottom of the block, as this is still a straight edge from the original square that we cut. With all of those points lining up, we can indeed now trim our first 2 sides. So we have our 3.25 inch mark in the center of our peak. We have a 1/4 inch above that peak. We know that the bottom of this block is still straight, so we make sure that our ruler is straight in that fashion and trim those first 2 sides. We can now just rotate this and place our trim down measurement of 3.5 by 6.5 on those freshly cut sides, and you'll notice that the diagonal from the ruler goes across that leg of the geese unit, and we can trim the final 2 sides. So if you don't have the Ultimate Flying Geese tool, it is still possible to use this method and have practically perfect flying geese every single time. We'll now move on to making the 4 half square triangle units that we need, and for this we'll take our 2 light 4-inch squares that we had from before and our 2 medium or dark 4-inch squares. We're going to draw a diagonal line on the back of our light squares, match these right sides together with the medium fabric, take it to the machine and stitch a 1/4 inch on each side of our drawn line. With that stitching now done, you know the drill. I like to press these first, cut them in half along our drawn line, and then press towards the darker of the two fabrics. Because these are on the outside corners, we don't need to worry about any nesting, so no special pressing instructions. And as you saw there, instead of using my rotary cutter, today I chose to use my scissor. For today's video, we see a return of my trimming down my half square triangles 2 at a time, and to achieve this I make sure that my seam line there is very snugly nested, and then I take my ruler and I place the diagonal from that ruler on the stitching line. I then make sure that there's enough fabric outside the trim down measurement, in this case that is 3.5 inches, before trimming away the first 2 sides. I then rotate the block around and I line up my trim down measurement of 3.5 inches on those freshly cut sides even, making sure that once again our diagonal line from our ruler is along our stitching line, and then we can trim those final 2 sides. Alternatively, and because I still have it to hand, we can use our makeshift block lock, which you've seen me use in previous videos. We now have all of the pieces that we need to make the outside frame of this block, and it does leave it with a 6.5 inch center. Pat has provided for us in the pattern an applique basket to place in the middle of this block, and she does state in the pattern that that is optional. If you weren't using it, you would just have a 6.5 inch square. I made the applique basket, and that's why I changed the dark and the medium around, so that I had the dark basket with the medium on the edges. In the top right hand corner I will link to a video on how I do the applique, and you'll be able to do the basket following that tutorial. What I decided to do, however, for the center of my block was to do an economy style block using a Creative Grid square on square 6-inch trim tool. This trim tool has you start with a 2-inch square, but I didn't want as many layers around my square on square, so I started with 2 1/8 of an inch square, which doesn't sound like that much of a difference, but it just means that I can start at A2 on the tool, and that will become clear once I pull the tool in to show you. But to begin using this tool, we then from the tool cut out the required sizes as listed from A2, A3 and A4. So A2 is the white that you see me doing now, A3 will be my blue fabric, and A4 once again is the white fabric. We need to cut 2 squares of each of the sizes listed on the tool and cut them in half on the diagonal just once. My fan is on. It was a very hot day in February when I was filming this, so the pieces are flying. We then need to attach these pieces around that square in the square on square or economy block fashion, and I'm just laying them all out for you here so that you can get a feel for my final center that I'm making. And this will finish at 6 inches. As the tool suggests, it is a 6-inch finished square on square tool. Once we have all of these pieces ready and I'm happy with how they're lining up, I will begin stitching those triangles onto my center square, press out towards those triangle pieces that we're adding on. In all instances, we can do opposite sides of the square at the same time, so I'll just quickly stitch all 4 of these on and I'll finally reveal the tool. Now that we have our first round of half square triangles sewn around our center square, we're going to bring in the tool that I mentioned before. This is the square on square 6-inch trim tool. We started with A2 as our outside squares, so what we need to do is line up that marked square on the tool, which is where I got the measurement for my 2 5/8, and line that up as best we can, and then trim on those two sides. We then just rotate this around, line up that square again, and trim our final two sides, and we're ready to do the next round. Once we add the next round, we will just repeat this step and then onto our third round. And when we're on our third round, we will be using the outside of the tool because it finishes completely at that 6.5 inches to give us a 6.5 inch finished square on square block. Creative Grids has lots of useful tools, and of course you can trim these down without the tool, but I may save that for another video. Leave me a comment in the box below if you'd like to see me do this without using the specific tool. I've also provided in the link in the description box below, a link on where you can purchase this tool. With our A3 fabrics now sewn on, we of course need to use our A3 square that's on our tool to line up to do our trimming. So once again, we'll line that up, trim one side, turn it around, trim the other side. You'll see here that I'm not exactly perfect, but that's okay. Just making sure that those outside 1/4 inch measurements are falling outside those points of our square in the middle so that we don't lose any of them when we sew the next layer around. With the final layer of our half square triangles attached, we now of course just need to use the A4 line to line up our square in the center and trim this down to its final 6.5 unfinished size. We're then ready to pull in our frame pieces from earlier and lay this out as per the pattern, and this will go together in a 9-patch fashion. We'll start by sewing all of our vertical seams and then doing our horizontal seams. I do believe throughout though that I do bring in a few of my tips and tricks for the pressing and clipping seams and such, so we'll touch on those when we get to them. For now though, I will lay this out and I'll start sewing our vertical seams. Substitute the center of the block for whichever method you use, be that the applique basket, the square on square that I've just shown you, or a plain square, or a feature fabric in the center. As I said, we'll now start sewing this together as a 9-patch. with all of our vertical seams now sewn, and as you can see, I'm just doing this chain piecing. I'm trying not to cut the thread. So I've got the first 2 layers here, and we're just going to clip either side of the point of our square on square center block here so that we can press our seam allowances in opposing directions, thus avoiding any bulk or bumpy seams. We're going to do the same on the top and the bottom row where our half square triangles are sewn on either side of our flying geese. You'll see what I mean when I bring the pressing mat here in a minute. So we just open this seam up and we press it in the opposite direction so that the bulk is actually going the way that it wants to sit. So trimming that in the middle there just means we're not forcing one of these seam allowances against its will. We'll press those down and we'll do the same on that center block, and then we will have all of our intersections nesting for when we sew our horizontal seam to connect this top row to the center row. We'll repeat that again for the bottom row, sewing that on, pressing that on. What is it, a nail? A stick-on nail? When we get to sewing on our bottom row and we have nice crisp points and our bulk is going where we want it to go, leaving us with a nice and smooth block. I'll once again fast forward through this, but I'll touch on how I press that horizontal seam once it's been stitched into place. We now need to press that first horizontal seam that we did, and you can see here I'm just having a play looking at it, and I decide it's going to be way too bulky. So what I'm going to do is spin this intersection. We do have 7 layers of fabric coming together at this point. So to spin the intersection, we just pick out those few stitches that are above our horizontal seam line, and we open up that seam and spin all of our seam allowances in the same direction. And what that does is just opens up those 7 layers and stops them from being so bulky. When we come to do the same thing for this other side, I just once again pick out those few stitches above our horizontal line, open up that seam allowance and press the seam allowances in the direction that we want, and we get nice flat points there, and we won't have anything bulky for our machine to go over when we come to quilt this. I'll attach the other side in the same fashion, open up those seams once again, get a beautifully flat block, and our block for this week, after a very long and very talky video, is done. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here and joining me for another fun-filled week of how-to step-by-step tutorials. I really do enjoy putting these together, and I would love for you to leave me a comment in the box below. It really helps me out, and it's a great way of engaging with you all. Also, while you're there, put the little thumbs up for me, will ya? There's a treasure. Subscribe if you haven't already done so, and tickle that little bell icon to be notified of all my future releases. I will see you all again real soon. Bye for now.